Dr. Tom O'Connor is internationally recognized for his communication, facilitation, and culture change skills in the specialty area of criminal justice. A native of Ireland who now holds dual citizenship in the US, Tom has earned degrees, get this, in law, philosophy, theology.
And Linda, you're going to have to unmute yourself because you've been automatically muted.
Oh,
there you go.
You've heard up till now?
Yeah, maybe the last two sentences we missed.
Okay. So you heard that Tom has earned degrees in law, philosophy, theology, counseling, and religion. Tom's cutting-edge work on facilitating whole system change takes him to many states in the US and to countries such as New Zealand, Canada, Australia, England, Ireland, France, and Estonia. Tom's company, Transforming Corrections, fosters change in criminal justice, agencies, staffs, and clients. Tom is a lifelong learner with a unique perspective on the human condition. He grew up in a working class area of Dublin and lived as a friar, a wandering monk for 9 years within a Catholic religious order called the Carmelites. Tom lives in Oregon with Aslan, his wife, and Sorcha, his daughter. So, Tom, Nancy, I think you're going to ask the first question.
Right. Well, I am just so pleased, Tom, that we are doing this. From the talks you and I have had, I'm so impressed with implementation science and what that can add to this whole thing we're doing with dialogue. So let me ask if you'll start there with saying something about the relationship between dialogue and implementation science, and what is really implementation science?
Well, then I need to take people, and good morning, everybody, on a bit of a journey. And the question I would ask you, Nancy, Linda, and everyone is, have you ever been involved with a team of people who are well-meaning, smart, intelligent people, and set out to do something, and they had a great project in mind, and the project didn't succeed? So I think we're all familiar with that, especially in organizations, right? So that experience of failure of implementation is so common. It began to crop up in every field. It cropped up in corrections. We spent the last 30 years trying to implement evidence-based practices. We know there are certain things that are effective. We're not really doing them, so we've been trying to bring those into the field with some success, but kind of little success for the amount of training and effort we put into it. So,
and I noticed, Tom, that in your paper, you said that it was like only 14% of implementations actually succeed, which was astounding to me.
That's right. It's kind of in the low 40. It's kind of around the low 20%, right? That actually succeed. And by succeed, we mean full implementation. And that means that people demonstrably benefit. So you have to, there's some positive outcome for people or the community. So these failures were common in healthcare and education and criminal justice and business across all of the fields. So people began to look at this and say, wait now, what's this gap about, this implementation gap? And they looked at the implementation process itself. And that's what implementation science is about. It's about that implementation process across all of the fields.
And so now you're now applying that, as I understand it, to dialogue. So will you build that connection for us?
Yeah, well, so there's a helpful thing called the 3-box model of implementation. So I could boil implementation down to science to 3 things. So there's the 3-box model, and there's 3 things you really need to do. And I'll give you an analogy. Our backyard here is full of creeping buttercups, right? So those buttercups have come in, the grass has gone, and now we have creeping buttercups throughout our backyard. The soil is perfectly suited to producing creeping buttercups. If we got the best grass seed in Oregon and we put grass seed into our backyard, what would we get? We'd get creeping buttercups because the soil is producing creeping buttercups. That grass seed wouldn't sprout. Even if we planted the seed in the right way, it wouldn't sprout, right? So what we'd have to do is till the soil, first of all. We'd have to amend the soil. And that's the first box in implementation science. In every organization, every family, every situation is perfectly conditioned to produce what it's producing. If you want change, you want to implement something new, you need to till the soil. So that's the first box. Then you need to plant evidence-based practices. You can't just throw anything into it. Once you have the soil nice and tilled, you want to get as best you can, best practices or evidence-based practices, and you put them into the soil. So that's the second box, is getting the evidence-based practice. The third box then is how you implement. There's a whole science around the way of implementation. So there's a whole bunch of things that you need to do about how you plant the soil. So you till the soil, you get the evidence-based practice, and you plant it in the right way. Where does dialogue belong? Dialogue belongs in tilling the soil. Dialogue is par excellence. It's just a wonderful way of creating a new culture that is open to receiving new seed, that is open then to planting that seed in the right way.
That's really helpful. And say a little bit also about what evidence-based practice looks like for you, or what are the elements of that?
Yeah, well, that's there's a definition for evidence-based practice. You'll hear people saying this is evidence-based practice, but there are really criteria for evidence-based practices. So you need at least 2 random controlled studies to see, does this practice actually produce the results if it's implemented with fidelity? So there's a whole set of criteria around something being named an evidence-based practice. And in each of the fields, then they have sets of criteria that practice, it has to be tested. It's like, the vaccine, the coronavirus vaccine. It's not an evidence-based practice yet, almost. We're almost there, but look what we had to go through to make sure that this works. That's what an evidence-based practice means.
All right. So the first step is tilling the soil, and you're saying dialogue is connected to that. And so say a little more about how does dialogue till the soil? Why does that particularly work?
Yeah, well, I'll give you the example. In the paper that some people may have read, we talk about the story in Yamhill. It's a local probation officer in Oregon, and we began working with them, and they were interested in the seed, in the evidence-based practices. So we had a practice model that blended all of the evidence-based practices together. There's a bunch of them in corrections. And we had come up with a model that really integrated all of those practices and gave some guidance to officers about when they use this seed and when they use that part, right? So there's a practice model, and we had a way of implementing it. They were, and most agencies then would go straight, okay, give us that model, train us, and we'll implement it, right? They'll jump over the first box. So in Yamhill, we began to work with John, who's actually on the call. So John was the deputy director in the agency, really interested in looking at this. But we kind of started talking about it, and we realized, oh gosh, there's some tensions between the officers. They don't quite get on together. They don't quite work as a team. John was a new supervisor, and he had some growing edges in himself. He was, there was a lack of confidence in his own skills. So what was going on in the context was really not conducive yet to planting the seed. So we began to use dialogue, John and I, and coaching. So John and I began to converse and began to talk and do a little bit of coaching. John begins to get a sense of what this is. We started a dialogue process with the staff. We had to kind of create a context in which they would work as a team. Now, if you go into Yamhill, you'd see they're like a synchronized swimming team. It's like what we saw in Virginia. Like what Harold has done in Virginia, he did the same thing. He created that context where people are able to think and talk together effectively. Once you've got that context, bang, you're able to do all sorts of things.
It's almost like you created a learning culture. You really had to do that first before you could get to the,
That's right. And the dialogue and the coaching, they're the 2 big things that we have found that are really critical to enabling that soil, tilling that soil, creating the culture.
And it reminds me that in the Virginia example, and folks that may not know, we did an interview with Harold Clark, who has brought dialogue to Virginia Department of Corrections. Some 13,000 employees are skilled in dialogue, which is great. And so you're saying that was Harold tilling the soil there, really providing the dialogue skills.
That's right. He was creating a healing culture. So that was a new culture, and you know, that process of creating, and that we know from dialogue that potential, right? If we go to the potential in the room, and dialogue really is about the whole. There's something about dialogue that gets us to the whole, not to parts, right? Bill Isaacs says that dialogue is a conversation with a center, not sides. I would add that dialogue is a conversation about the whole, not the parts. So you're talking about the whole culture, the whole meaning system that's working between people. And that's what needs to be developed. And it's almost like it's already there. It's like that acorn metaphor, but you have to peel away some of the debris that is built up in that culture to allow the culture to come up. It's present. People have it. We all have it. We all have this natural, inherent dynamism to understand everything about everything. We ask questions about everything. You know, what time is it? What time is it in Ireland, right? How many people are on the call? What about what's going on in the world with COVID? What's going on in the world with physics? What's going on in the universe? How many galaxies are there? Is there anything beyond the galaxies, right? So we have this as people, our core identity, I believe, is not I'm an Irishman, I'm a woman, that's part of our identity, but our core identity is that we are people who have this unrestricted desire to know everything about everything. We want to know the whole. And that's the process of dialogue releases that energy and allows it to surface. Once you do that, then all these kind of good things start happening.
Yeah, that's a lovely explanation, and I love the example of your garden or your yard behind. I think that's a really helpful way to think about it. Is there more to say about the meaning of dialogue or the skills related to dialogue? I know you very heavily use Kantor skills, which also are used at in the Virginia Correctional System. Is there more to say about that?
Yeah, the 4-player action, the move, follow, oppose, and bystand, they're kind of really important to get a balance between people, because it's hard to get the opposing voice up in an organization. So you can help people really begin to learn, oh, it's safe here to oppose. And once you get that balance in, it's safe here to bystand. It's very scary to bystand and to say, hey, this is what I noticed happening in the room. There are 6 of us in the meeting. Only 3 of us are talking and 3 of us are quiet. Every time we meet, that's what happens. So you're revealing that pattern, and that's a scary thing to do. So it's around building the safety for people to be able to use those voices. But there's another thing that I think, Nancy, we should talk about is if dialogue is the instrument of cultural growth and tilling the soil, we're the instrument of dialogue. That's about, it's us, right? This is what Bohm talks about. It's human consciousness engages in the dialogue. So I think what we need to do is to get a better understanding of our own consciousness. What is that? Because that's the core, I don't know if the skill is the right word, but that's the core structure of dialogue, is human consciousness. So that's where I would like to go today a little bit about, is can we understand our consciousness a little bit more and guide people through kind of an exploration of that.
Good. Let's do that then. Can we move in that direction around looking at that consciousness more?
Okay, so then if we do that, what I'd like to ask everybody, I'd like to lead you in an exercise in which you'll get a chance to examine your consciousness a bit, right? So what I'm going to do is give you all a riddle. I want you to answer a riddle, and then I'm going to ask you to come up with your own answer, and then we'll break you into small breakout rooms, and you can get a team answer to the riddle. So this exercise, though, is not so much about getting the answer, right? You need to do that because that's what the action is as the subject. That's what we want you to do. But while you're doing that, I want you to pay attention to what's happening in your consciousness. What is your mind doing? What are your feelings doing? What's going on inside of you as you work this riddle on your own and then with the team? Okay? So, and then we'll come back and we'll kind of break that down a bit.
Okay.
So let me share the screen and I'll put up this riddle for you. Let's go here. So here's the riddle. And again, it's just your own answer. And we just give you a couple of seconds for that, then go into the team and get the team answer. Watch what's happening in your mind. So here's the riddle. If I have a baseball bat and a ball, and together they cost $1.10. Okay, so the bat and the ball cost $1.10 together. Now, if the bat costs $1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost on its own? Together $1.10, the bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost on its own? Okay, so if you've got your answer, let's go into the groups and get the team answer. We give you about four or 5 minutes, and then we come back and we'll kind of take a look at what's going on. Yeah, so let's touch base. Let's get a couple of teams to give us their answer. What was well, first of all, what was everybody's initial answer?
10 cents for the ball.
Okay.
$1 for the bat. But
Did
then
everyone, go ahead.
that felt wrong, but we couldn't ever come up with what was right.
Funny how that is, isn't it?
So we had someone who could put it into an algebraic equation, and they explained to us why the ball was 5 cents. And I actually understood it, but I would have never come up with that answer myself. So
other experiences.
Yeah, we were the same, Tommy. We initially started with the obvious answer, and then because it was obvious, we said it must be wrong. And we looked at it some more, and we came up with the 5 cents for the ball in the end.
Great.
Hello.
But we didn't have an
everybody hear me fine?
algebraic formula, I'm afraid. We weren't that sophisticated.
Hello. I don't think our group, we didn't agree on the answer, but it was a great exercise for me. And when Dr. Tom O'Connor said to think of consciousness, my brain kind of split into two. I had my initial answer, and then I had second thoughts about how to rationalize that answer. So it kept going, which was really interesting. Thank you.
Did you notice that? What about feelings? What did people notice about their feelings? So that was great, the way my mind kind of had to keep working. What about feelings?
In our, okay, will I go ahead? In our group, we never got to the answer. We just discussed what was going on in our brains once we were asked the question. And, well, and I think there was some common recognition that, you know, fear of criticism or fear and the context, how we respond really depends on the context of how safe we feel. In the group that might be asking the question, whether we might think someone's going to be very critical if we fail, and whether your brain actually relaxes enough to answer the question freely, depending on how safe you feel actually working at answering the question. So.
Yeah, so you can see, folks, a lot of things going on, right? Everybody has the initial answer, the 10-cent answer, and then you kind of keep going. And you get to the 5-cent answer, which is the correct answer, but there are clearly some people may not see why it's 5 cents. So let me just walk through that briefly to show you why it's 5 cents, just so you can get it. So together they cost $1.10, right? So if the ball is 10 cents, which is our first answer, what's $1 more than 10 cents is $1.10, right? Add the two together and you get $1.20. So that's too much, it's not correct. Oh, okay, it must be less than 10 cents then. And let's try zero. That's what we did in our group, a zero. Well, it's $1 more than zero, that's $1. Ah, that's not right, that's $1. So it can't be zero. Oh, maybe it's somewhere in between. And we went 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then Sharon popped, oh, I got it, it's 5 cents, right? And that was the moment then when we knew that we had the answer. So what's going on here? So this is the kind of structure, I call this the river of dialogue, right? When we're together like that and our consciousness is working at these it could be anything, right? What are we going to do about COVID? What are we going to do about climate change? What are we going to do about creating a healing culture? So we have an experience which you had this morning, and you got some data of sense. You saw the picture, you got the data, the riddle. But you also have data of consciousness, because as you're working, we're always aware of what we're doing with our consciousness. So we're the subject of our consciousness. And when you were aware of those feelings, I'm asking questions, I'm trying to think, oh, this is what's going on. That's data for you about what your consciousness is like. When we have an experience, what happens is we ask this question: what is the answer? That's where you all went right away and you got an answer. You all said, oh, I got it, it's 10 cents. So that was a moment of insight, right? And what you have is an understanding, and it's intelligent. Nobody said it's $1,000. So the answer of 10 cents is an intelligent answer, and you get to intelligence when you ask this question, what is it? But your mind is not satisfied with that question alone. Your mind wants to ask another question. Is it so? Is it really 10 cents? And now you're asking a different question. Your consciousness is seeking not insight or understanding, it's seeking truth. It wants to know the right understanding. Is my understanding correct? So that's when you get to the 5-cent answer. That's when you arrive at knowledge. So you only arrive at knowledge when you've gone through these 3 levels. And when we're working with people like this, we'll do this exercise with people, and we'll say, well, as we're having a dialogue, we'd say, well, is that your 10-cent answer or your 5-cent answer? So it's very important, because who would get on a plane that is a 10-cent plane? To build a plane, you have to get 5-cent answers to make sure it's safe. And to build our human society, we have to get 5-cent answers. The problem is, all of us felt like, oh, this is too hard. I don't have the confidence to do this. I'm not good at math. I'm going to stop. And Kahneman, thinking fast and thinking slow, he says the 10-cent thinking is the norm in society. There's something about us that wants to get off the bus when we get the easy answer, and it's difficult to get to the 5-cent answer. This is why the tension of dialogue is difficult for even people to go into dialogue. We're not finished there, right? So when you know what the reality is, when you know what's real, another question pops up, and it's this one. Oh, now it's the question of ethics. What should we do now that we know what the reality is? Is global warming happening? Well, yes, it is. Oh, well, what do we need to do? So now we're into the realm of ethics, morality, justice, and values, right? So now we're trying to decide based on our knowledge. And this is all in our consciousness, and this is what's happening in dialogue. You're not finished there yet, though, either, because there's another question that comes up, and it's this one. So only when we get to that question have we got to dialogos, true meaning, have we got to the real meaning of what it is to be human. Because this question is above, it takes us beyond even the morality question. And the example I give for people on that is, if you think about, well, what's the atom bomb? People ask, what's that? Oh, it's a big thing. If you set it off, it kills lots of people, releases lots of power. Really? Is that true? Does that happen? Yes, it's true. We've tested it. Well, is that a good thing? Well, yes, it's a good thing, because we needed to stop the war. And we dropped it in Hiroshima. And then there's a big debate about whether it's a good thing or not a good thing. And it's a valid debate. There's a real debate about that. It's still going on. But if you ask the question, was it a loving thing to drop the bomb? It's a different question than is it a good thing? So this is the river of dialogue, the structure of our human consciousness. And when we create this dialogical moment that people have, that we know that people have, they're in their river. That to me is what a dialogical moment is. And there's a lot of times where we get off our own consciousness and bias creeps in and we don't get to these right answers. That's the process of dialogue that I see.
Wow. Well, that is very powerful, Tom. Incredibly powerful. So I'm assuming then that you're using that kind of an approach in tilling the soil. And I guess what I'm getting from the paper and hearing you describe this, when you were first using the implementation model and you didn't have dialogue, it just wasn't working correctly. But once you introduced the dialogue, then you could take the implementation model and everything kind of went better because people felt safe. They could talk about their vulnerabilities, just like, I mean, I did this riddle with you the other day and I felt stupid. You know, I had to admit to you, my math is terrible. I really don't know how to do this, right?
Exactly. And I think that's one, let me do one more thing because, well, let's show you this, because something else you're saying there is really important. So, because look what's going on here. Our feelings, you think this is intellectual, but this is what's happening. Our feelings are the mass, momentum, and movement of all our knowing and doing. So our feelings are woven into this consciousness process at all the stages. And that's why if we have a deficiency story we're telling ourselves, it's difficult to do this. If we have, you know, so it's kind of critical what you're saying there, Linda, about the role of feelings.
And it's really where you can help team members in particular, I would think, diversify or differentiate enough so that they, you know, if I heard one group say, well, one of us knew how to put it in an equation format. Yes. Not everybody knows how to do that, right? So once you can be vulnerable, then you can start to reach out for help.
And you can accept that help. You don't feel slighted because someone has more knowledge than you, whatever it is. The team in Yamhill, they had tried for years. They've been trained in motivational interviewing. It's an evidence-based practice. It's really, really helpful. But they weren't using those skills. It hadn't taken. The seed hadn't, you know, they've been trained. We call it the train and pray method. We send a bunch of people to training. We pray that something's going to be different when they come back. It doesn't work. And we spend gazillions of dollars doing it, right? It doesn't work. There's even a study that the people who developed motivational interviewing, the people, they trained a group of people. They went off, they said, are you using it? Yes, we're using it. But they measured their skills and their skills got worse after the training, not better, because they weren't coached to really use it and they didn't have the soil. So it's really important that we kind of use this implementation science structure to implement the practices that we know are loving, that we really need for the world, that are going to kind of make a difference.
You know, this is so typical of almost any sort of educational environment where people simply forget that if you don't have the basic communication skills to deliver the learning or the training, it doesn't matter what you're trying to teach, right? Because the consciousness isn't grabbing it. There's, as you say, that the soil hasn't been tilled.
That's right. It's the context conditions consciousness.
Right. Right.
So it's even beyond communication skills. Remember when Bill talked about, I was really impressed when we met, and Harold, you know this, that it's the dialogue it's the center. It's not even between me and you, us being the good communicators. It's more about what's happening, the whole that's emerging. Somehow the dialogue allows that to emerge.
Well, it's a consciousness shift as well.
That's right. That's it. That's
you know,
right.
In other words, if you have, as a trainer or as a leader of a team, if you have the consciousness shift to be in dialogue with whoever you're coaching or you're in the team with, that it's not so important what you feel, but it's important that you're drawing others out all the time, so that you're continuously drawing out sort of that river of dialogue, that river of consciousness. That's what the focus needs to be, right?
I like that image, the river that you're using, because I think that's right. You know, you have that feeling of being in a river. You have that feeling of being part of something whole, bigger, more than you. And the team in Yamhill, I mean, it's just beautiful to see. And when we saw it at the conference with the Virginia people, when you see this in action, what people are able to do is astounding. And there's just it's a dance. It's, you know, it's poetry in motion. It's wonderful what is possible.
Well, and I would imagine in the context in your work with probation officers, in a sense, you're teaching them how to work with the people they're working with, right? The offenders. So in other words, if they've made that mindset shift, they can take what they're supposed to be doing and just do it better, right?
Well, yes, but now you see, now you're into the seed. You're out of the per se, because now what you're talking about is the skill, the evidence-based practice, right? So, but I think and exactly, it's a whole. And then there's a way of coaching to that evidence-based practice, because we know if we don't do the coaching, the practice doesn't take. Right. So that's part of the implementation process, right? But I'm not teaching people dialogue. They know how to do that already. Mm-hmm. I don't teach people that. That's in us. That's our consciousness. Everybody comes to the room. Everybody has everything they need. They don't need I need to teach them. They don't need to learn anything. It's inherent. It's our internal dynamism. It's our core identity as a human being. We have human consciousness. Human consciousness is what dialogue is about.
So what you're doing, in a sense, is you're assuring that the soil allows for psychological safety, allows for equal voice, allows for the suspension of assumptions that then they can use. But if you've got equal voice, and if you feel safe, then you're saying you already have the skills you need. Is that it?
That's right. Well, you have the consciousness, and then these practices, these dialogical practices are real important because they allow that consciousness to flourish. So then we use the equal voices, we use the four voices, we use inquiry and advocacy, and we get that blend, we get the suspension. In Virginia, they learned how to listen. Every time you talk to them, you can tell a superintendent, well, I never listened, I just made decisions, now I listen. It's a simple thing, but it really makes a huge difference. That's why but I'm kind of really taken by, I'm taken by Bill Isaacs too. He says, this is not difficult. You don't need a master's degree, to get a group of people to have a dialogue. Anybody, a group of teenage kids in a school can have a dialogue. Why? They've got this human consciousness. Right, it's creating the conditions that allow that to happen. So it is about the context.
So Tom, you don't actually put them into dialogue, as we might say in another context. You come in as coach, and you understand what you're doing, and you're bringing the dialogue out in the team. Is that correct? That's
right. And we just focus on that. And we know from implementation science, it's the first box. And the problem people make is they jump to the second box. Give me that practice. I want to know how to do it. And they go there. They jump out of the context. And that's a common mistake, but it's fine. It's just a human mistake, but it's not effective. So exactly, Nancy or Linda, and just because we focus there, we just help them focus there, and we stay there. And we're able to stay there. People begin to relax. People begin to get it. It begins to emerge. It's pretty simple, really.
Okay, because at that point, they've already been through their so-called training. They know what it is they're supposed to be doing, but they haven't been successful. So your work is to get them to kind of slow down and to really go into sort of the dialogical mindset. And then they then the light bulb goes on, because then they can take what they've learned and present it in a new way.
And they have to feel safe enough to slow down. It has to, the feelings come in again, the safety, and then their mind starts working. Yeah. Right? And that consciousness kicks in, exactly.
And we did have
sorry, but then what happened was they'd been to training, but they didn't even understand some of it. Then the hunger. Right. They started hungering for motivation. How do I get better at that? Right. Then they started having little competitions. Well, she's better than me. I'm not going to have that happening. Mm-hmm. And they started having fun. And then they got really vulnerable with each other. They would practice and reveal themselves. They would never share what they would do with a client before. It's all in their own office. Now they practice, they role model, they do all that because they have that ability.
Got it. But what you're really doing, they don't probably get it completely. Maybe they do eventually, but in the beginning, they're learning dialogue because they feel a need. They're not sure why they're not successful. But once you start to talk to them about some of the qualities of dialogue and use and model the qualities, then they start to get it, right?
I think you're on to something real important there, Linda, because we all have that feeling, don't we? We know there's something we don't know.
Yeah.
We know there's something not working.
Right.
That's core. That's that unrestricted desire to know. We kind of have a notion of it, an expectation, but we know we haven't got there yet.
Yeah.
And that's the dynamism that wants to get there.
Yeah.
And can we just have a few minutes left? And I really am dying to ask you this question, Tom. So Linda described you as the wandering monk and so forth. So clearly the experience within the Catholic Church, your experience as a monk, and I have to note that in the first flyer I sent out, I called you a wandering monk instead of a wandering monk, which I thought was really appropriate, not intentional but appropriate. But to what extent has that influenced what you're doing now, what you're doing with dialogue, or has an influence?
Yeah, it's a lot. Well, thank you for the question, Nancy, because I think it really did. And you're taking me back to my first year. You know, I studied law for 6 years when I left school, and 2 days after my final exam, I was in the novitiate with the Carmelites. I did my exams, and then I went off to my spiritual year. So I had a year of rest, and that year I didn't have to study. I just had to learn the community life. And there was I think it was a dialogue. I mean, it was a moment that something happened for me at that time that it started a gyroscope within me. And that gyroscope has just kept moving. And then I think my studies, the philosophy, this consciousness work is really based on the work of a Jesuit from Canada, Bernard Lonergan, died a few years ago. So my studies, I think it was a great gift to learn, to be able to take time to focus on this and develop this. So yes, it really does. So, you know, even in the Catholic tradition, it was, you know, the tradition of inform your conscience, and the primacy of human conscience, of individual conscience. The Catholic teaching is that it's really about you're the one who decides, not the Pope, not the bishop. It's you've got to inform your conscience so that you make loving decisions. So I think that's part of where I've come from.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
I like that in. Yeah.
Yeah. We are at the time when we're going to put people into small groups. Do you want to help people know what they're going to do in their small groups, Linda?
Sure. So again, you'll be coupled up with probably 4 people. Bobby, I think groups of 4, and we'll go about it's like 15 minutes.
15 minutes, yeah.
15 minutes, yeah. So discuss among yourselves how this might enhance your own practice of dialogue, your own work. And of course, if there's any further questions for Tom, we'll have time at the end of that, and we'll let you put questions in the chat. But this is really your time to just kind of digest what you've learned from Tom in this little riddle exercise. And then we'll see you on the other side, and we'll have some time for questions, answers, and some reflections on the whole session today. I think your name is pronounced Kaja Young. Can you ask Tom your question? I think that's a very good opening one.
Yeah, it's Khadija. Hi, Tom. So we're from Tabor Foundation, and Tom has been doing a lot of coaching with various team members just to sort of introduce who we are. So yeah, Tom, I wanted to ask you, we discussed a little bit in our group towards the end about the question that you raised. Is it loving? Like asking yourself, sorry, is something loving to, I guess, reach a decision or sort of make a kind of positive move in a certain direction. So I wanted to, and Marie in our group did give a very good example that she's working on at the moment. I wanted to see if maybe you could give an example, maybe a real life example that you're able to mention of how a team was able to, you know, maybe they were stuck in a point and they were able to use that to come to some kind of consensus. Thank you.
Well, could you say a little bit more about why you guys are asking that question and the example that you have.
And Bobby, could I ask you to let us see people's faces as they ask, or turn all the faces back on?
Yeah, so people just need to turn their video back on, and you can go on to gallery view now, or speaker view. So I've unspotlighted everybody.
Great. Okay. So then.
So Claudia, did you want to give an example of maybe where you were coming from with that question?
Sure. And sorry, I just don't have a camera available right now. So I'm thinking sort of within our organization, we're making sort of decisions on lots of different kind of, everyone's coming from sort of different viewpoints. So we might have a finance person there, we might have a program manager person there, we might have a HR person present, we might have a board director present, etc. So people are coming from different viewpoints, and we may be saying, like, should we go into this? So I'm not thinking of a specific, I don't have a specific example, but should we, launch this new program or changes about the program for the students? Like, should we, for example, put everything online and start offering some of our courses on tablets, just as an example? So people may come from different viewpoints and have different things to say, like, finance-wise, it can't be done right now, and, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just trying to think, like, is because I'm thinking the closest we've come to kind of asking ourselves, what is this loving, is, ultimately what's good for the students. And if it's sort of what we feel is best for the students, then we're going to kind of go for it. I think we probably have been in that position before. So I guess, Tom, what I'm asking is, ultimately, how could we use that? How can we best use that in our decision making?
Yeah, that's
does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that really helps. So you see what I'm noticing, this just to suspend the way you're describing it. The question really hasn't quite emerged yet for you as a collective. You are thinking a lot of around.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's the input, but it doesn't mean that it's not present. You all, if our human consciousness is going in, and that's the arrival point, it means it's present, even that you're asking that question. And this, Khadija, is what I find in most people. Like, so I work a lot in the prison context. And I've raised this question. I remember sitting in an office with the superintendent and the lieutenants and the captains, and we raised the question, well, is this a loving thing to do in the prison? And there was kind of silence. But the question at least was raised, and most people say, well, I can get to the is it good question, but I don't think it's my job. A judge will say, it's not my job to ask the is it loving question. That's too much, that's kind of, it's not my job. So I think we have a real, tension around this question. It's not, like Nancy said in one of our last dialogues, it's not an easy question to ask, and there's a reason for it, right? Because it's at the fullness of what it is to be human. But our structures and our current context really doesn't allow it to come out so much. So I think you're on the right track just by saying, oh gosh, we don't really ask that question consciously. It's there, but we don't go. And if you do, I think then you're into the level of meaning. And the level of meaning, humor, mercy, you see all of those things, we have those words in society because we know mercy is, do justice, is fairness, equality, reciprocity. But we know mercy is different than justice. When you laugh, you kind of, you might be in a terrible situation, but you at least you find something funny in it. You transcend the morality of it. You go into a different level. So I think you're on the right track. I don't know the answer about how but you will know.
There's a question that kind of follows that one that Betsy has asked about the River of Dialogue model. Can you, Betsy, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
I forgot my question. Can you ask my question?
Yeah, you said love this river of dialogue
Oh, yeah,
model.
yeah,
Do
yeah.
people you've worked with resist the notion of the highest level? Is it loving?
Yeah, I know of only one organization, a utility in Texas, and when they set their values, they debated for a long time about service or compassion, and finally the person who's working with them said, I think what you're really talking about is love. And they agreed, and they put the word love as one of their values on a huge granite boulder as you drive up to their office. But it seems very hard to introduce it in many organizations. So
I really like that story. Somehow it's easy for us. We all know that we want a loving family.
mm-hmm.
And we want to send our kids to schools that would be a loving environment, right? I don't know why it is. Why not have a loving prison?
Right.
Why not having, a loving accountant? I mean, really. So yeah. So it's there's something about it that's really, really challenging for us.
At the same time, I think you're right that it is part of what is deep in people that we've come to believe for whatever reason that it's not okay to bring that up in a work setting.
Yeah.
Kelly Rass, ODOC, I'm not sure if that's your last name. Can you unmute and ask your question about communities of practice and dialogue?
Yes, and no, that's not my last name, the Oregon Department of Corrections, which I proudly represent.
I figured, I just didn't know.
Yes, and Harold, lovely to see you, Jeff, some other folks that are in this shared field. And so, Tom, this is a continuing conversation that you and I you generously gave me some time earlier this week. But as we think about, and forgive me, I'm at home with my children. As we think about doing new things in a new world, so criminal justice, we have this wonderful time in which we're asked to think differently. Excuse me. I'm wondering, Tom, our community of practice groups, which we've looked at in the Oregon Department of Corrections, what's the connection or dialogue between dialogue and community of practice groups? Are they the same thing? Does a community practice group create a container for dialogue? Just trying to, as I'm thinking about how we can similarly, like Virginia, bring some of these structures into our system, would love a little info on the comparison.
Okay, that's a great question, and that's Augustus in the background. He's a character, so don't mind him, Kelly. He's fun, so that's fine. So I really, the question, the community. I think communities of practice would become a dialogue group if they take the "is it loving" question on board seriously. So I think that's all you need to do, and then you have a dialogue community of practice. You want a dialogue, you want a community of practice that is dialogical. And then the community of practice can practice around the seeds, some of the skills, some of the, they can practice around the implementation process. How do we sow the seed? So they can test, they can try things, they can do things, and they come back. And then if they have that container, and it's a loving container, they will really flourish. So I think you know the answer to your own question, right? So I think you're going in that direction.
So Maria, I think you're, I'm sorry. Is there someone else?
Go ahead, Linda.
Maria, have you ask a very interesting question? Would you be willing to ask that to Tom about teaching dialogue? You're probably muted. Let's see.
Yes, I was struck by something you said at the beginning of your presentation, that we don't have to teach dialogue. People have it in them to dialogue. It's the most natural thing and so on. And I think, at least in my experience working in organizations, I have sometimes met people who are very dogmatic, and they don't have they are dogmatic and they are not open to dialogue. So perhaps somewhere in their soul there is a desire to dialogue, but what do you do when you have stubborn, hard-headed people who simply want to preach and get people on their side?
Well, I was watching the other questions in the chat, because this is, I think a few people are bringing this up, right? Because you do have the river of dialogue, and to the extent that we're able to be faithful to our feelings, which move us through these questions, and we get the 5-cent answer, we get the 10-cent, the 10-cent answer is real important, then the 5-cent answer, then the good question, then the loving, and we kind of create a human society that is loving and good and real, you know, based in fact, scientific. So that's one river. Unfortunately, there's a different river going along at the same time in human consciousness, and it's the opposite. It's a river of decline, right? Because at every step in our consciousness, we're able to, we've got free will, and we're able to say, no, I'm not going to ask that question, right? And once we do that, we're introducing bias into the river. And that's the human dilemma. That's what Bohm was talking about, that our minds create everything and then says, I didn't do it, right? Because our mind creates what's good, but it also creates what's bad about our society. And we do it. You'd see it you'd see a politician on the radio or on the TV, and they're asked a question. And it's a good question by the interviewer, but they don't answer it. They will shift and they just go here, and what they're doing there is they're saying the 10-cent answer is good enough that I gave you. The interviewer knows it's not enough of an answer. They refuse and they stay with the 10-cent answer. So they have just dodged that is it so answer to where they want to stay. When they do that, they're introducing decline into society. So we really have two rivers going on. We have a river of progress towards the whole, and then we have a river of decline. So in the dialogical process, you really need to foster the river of progress, but you also need to reverse the river of decline. And that's what was happening in some of the groups this morning when people were saying, oh, I'm not good at math. I can't do this, right? So there there's a bit of that river of decline fostering, right? And coming and emerging. So you need to suspend that and just notice it. Because when you can do that, you can see those patterns of decline that groups have. And we all have them. And in 10 minutes, you'll have them. But you can suspend those patterns of decline and they can fade. So it's a dialectical process. You really need to be working on both valences. That's why there is a, you know, in the people we can get better at dialogue. It's in us, but we do need each other to figure this out. Because self-deception is a real thing. And in my own mind, in my own consciousness, it's too easy for me to deceive myself. I need people to oppose to help me understand what I'm missing and to see where I'm kind of doing things that are actually not good and not loving. So you see, we need that level of safety to be able to help each other. I'm sorry, what you just did wasn't, that wasn't a good thing that you did. So that's maybe, I think where Harold goes with the accountability. I'm not sure. I'm intrigued with Harold's notion of accountability because just how strong he is on that. So I think what he's doing is holding us accountable to answering each of those questions correctly.
Thank you, Tom. We should say, because not everybody has seen all these past videos, Harold is the director of the Virginia prison systems, and we did an interview with him, and that kind of leads me to another issue, which several people have said, could we see the slides, and not just the slides, I think they're saying, could we see the interview? And so the answer to that is that it will be up on the Academy site as soon as Bobby can get it up, which is probably 2 or 3 weeks. And if you're not a member of the Academy and can't get into it, if you send me a note, and you've got my email address because I responded to everyone, I'd be glad to send a copy of the video that we have today out to you. I can't send it out 100 times, but I can certainly send a number of them out. So that's that. I just wanted to put that in, but then I get to ask my next question, which is from Linda. And Ken, let me see if I'm doing this right. Can I have it? No, I'm sorry. It's Paula Downing. Would you unmute yourself and say what you mean? You're talking about staying there. What does it look like? Will you ask your question?
Yes, I will. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Tom. I'm from Dublin, a working class girl.
Go, Paula.
Nice to meet you. I suppose I don't. Let me see. How can I make this short? You said earlier that you have to get people to stay there. In other words, to not leap into wanting to get on with it. This is early on, when you were saying people want to get to the task, they just don't want to do with cultivating the soil. But we have to get them to stay there. And my question was, what does that look like, getting people to stay there? And I'm asking that because maybe other people are like me, that you're trying to do things, and dialogue is not something I know about it, but it's not something I do. I'd like to, but you don't necessarily have permission to do dialogue officially, right? So if you're being pragmatic and working with groups of people, they want to get stuff done. You're trying to do stuff better than normal. And I'm asking, if you don't have permission to sort of do let's look at all the roles, let's look at when we're suspending and bystanding, all that kind of stuff, what would it look like to just keep people there? Because I think that if we could keep people there, even implicitly rather than explicitly, that might help. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you're answering your own question with that implicit piece at the end. So I think that is the secret. And I'll give you an example. So I was working with a group, and they asked me to facilitate. It was an executive team for a Department of Corrections, and they asked me to facilitate. They just wanted a 2-hour conversation about a decision they had to make. So and they were clear, they didn't want any training, nothing up front. So there was no talk about dialogue, anything like that at the time. So, but I was asked to facilitate, so I was able to create the kind of flow of the conversation. And I was careful to role model at the start, or just clarify at the start what I would be doing, just a little bit of that. But we got to a point in the conversation, it was going great. People were talking. And it was kind of slow, but then one person on the team felt it was time, that they needed to stop it, and said, we don't have time for this. And said, well, Tom, thank you very much. This is great, but we don't have the time. We need to now move on. We're going to do this to make the decision. So there was the moment, right, about staying in. So my job at that stage was really I didn't know it would work, but I had to do a skillful oppose. So what I was able to say is, I understand where you want to get to this person, and I really had to listen to what she was trying to do. And I kind of picked that out. And then I said, but I think you're missing something. If you go to that direction, there's something waiting, there's something emerging here from all of you that you will miss. So that was the moment of helping her stay. And she turned to somebody else and said, well, what do you think? And the team began to weigh in, and they started saying, and they kind of decided to stay, but they kind of veered off for 10 minutes. Will we stay or will we not? And it was touch and go. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I had to stay. I had to stay, and they were free not to, but I had to stay. At the moment when she kind of told me like I was fired, basically, right, from the job, but I had to stay. I had to hold that ground.
And can I ask a supplementary? At that moment, Tom, was it real? Did you feel that they were collectively moving to something, and that the decision maker was kind of trying to move it along?
Oh yeah, no.
Oh yeah, so you wouldn't have said that if it wasn't real, because.
Oh yeah. Oh no, totally, honestly, Paula, yeah, it was totally real, and you could see there was some fear, something going on. Oh gosh, this is, it was going to move into the other river. Yeah.
Thanks, Tom. Lloyd, you have a couple things, but I think let's go back and see if perhaps Tom would give a different answer than he gave to Maria Ev with your question about the level of development. Would you be willing to ask that question?
Sure, yeah. Tom, I must say, I'm so excited about what you shared today. You give me some things to ponder and work into my worldviews. And I appreciate your saying that, we could all engage in dialogue because we all possess human consciousness. Now, how does the level of development of the participants in the dialogue, and by development, social, ethical, emotional, spiritual, and so on, how does that developmental level of the participants affect what the outcome will be in the dialogue?
Well, it's a beautiful question. Could you would you answer your question for a second, and then because I'd love to hear your answer.
Well, my answer coming into today would be that I think it has a strong impact, but I can also see the other side from what you've presented here, that if we can stay there, that everything is within each of us. I do believe that. And so does the fact that not everyone has developed to the same level, I don't think that precludes the possibility of drawing someone into that space.
I would follow that. I think that's really true, because, and if you think about it, we're all going into the space with our own consciousness and our own level of development. So if and I do think, like, when dialogue is working, everybody in the room is present, and that river is happening in each person. Now, the river may be more complex in one person than in another person, which is fine, right? Because that's the collective. So you'll have a young person who's really developing, maybe an older person who might be more developed, not necessarily, but there's kind of two individual rivers, but there's a collective river. So I think that's what you're touching on. The collective river blends and, in such a rich way, all those levels of development. I'm thinking of Kelly's son, Augustus, too. When you have a little conversation with Augustus, it's an amazing experience, and it's his level of consciousness, right? His level of development. But if you can kind of just tune into it, it's wonderful what happens, right? So there's something going on there.
Well, I think the key that you gave very early on in your introduction is that we have to keep the whole before us.
Really, yeah. Say more. I'm sorry. Just say more though about the whole, because that's where I'm trying to learn too.
Well, we have many different ways of knowing. And it's very easy for us to be drawn into the fragmentation of one of those ways of knowing. And the challenge when we're together is, how do we keep the whole there? And that the individual aspects we bring are expressed as a part of the whole rather than as our individual fragment.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
And I would, I don't know how to say your first name. I'm going to say it as Aislinn Adams, that you're asking a question about humor. Could you unmute and ask your question, which may take us in an entirely different direction, of course.
Hi, Nancy. I'm Ash. It's pronounced Aisling, but I should always put it in phonetically for people afterwards. Yeah, I just think I've heard you talk about this before. I should disclose, maybe I know Tom very well. He's my husband. But when you talk about humor, can you give a little bit on that? Because it's not just being funny, there's this whole other transcendent level to humor. So I think is often lost out in a lot of this. So, okay, I'll mute again.
Yeah, thanks, Aisling. Aisling is, so we have a lot of fun together. So the humor thing is, I love Kierkegaard said, the last, I can't remember the last speaker's Lloyd, right? What Lloyd said was, we've all different ways of knowing, right? It's not only different individual consciousnesses, but we can go into the aesthetic pattern of experience. We're listening to operas. We can go into the intellectual pattern of experience. We're asking questions. We can go into the prayer pattern of experience. We're meditating. All these different ways of knowing. So what Kierkegaard said was that there's the aesthetic level. When we're working most of the time, we're working on the aesthetic level. And for him, that was normal, common sense, everyday living. Then there was the moral level. And then for him was the meaning level. He called it the religious level, but it was really the meaning level. So he had the aesthetic, the moral, and the meaning level. And he said that sarcasm, or what's the other word for irony? Irony is a better word. Irony moves us out of the ordinary everyday life into the moral realm, right? So we begin to say, oh, maybe it's not the way it is. Oh yeah, that's a good point, right? If you're being ironic. But humor moves us out of the moral realm into the meaning realm. And I don't know, an example of this would be, where would I think? It's kind of like Laurel and Hardy or something like that, right? So they're in the middle of the desert. They just joined the Foreign Legion, the French Foreign Legion, and they're with everybody. And, they think they're with everybody, and they lose their bayonets, and they're lost together in the Sahara Desert. And, that's another fine mess you got me into, Laurel. It's just kind of, it's terrible situation, but there's humor in it. So you transcend the limitations of the system, of the context. And because we're able to transcend, we're at that level of meaning. Now you see, this is where we really live. We want to be, that's back to the whole. Even in the most terrible situations, we can be really funny. Well, what is that, right? If we're really having a belly laugh, and it's a disaster, right? That's something about transcending.
Thanks, Tom. Let's see, Jeff Duncan, would you be willing to ask your question about a loving prison? I'll have to unmute. Jeff, are you there? Jeff Duncan? Can't see you.
I am. I'm here.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, as far as like a loving prison, there's so much pain in a prison system. And it's not just on the people in custody's part, but it's also on the staff component. They're witnessing this. They live it every day, kind of thing. And I think that the loving question would really force everyone to recognize the amount of pain that's in that type of a system. And then we'd have to do something with it. And I was wondering, how would you get people to turn off or to do something with that self-protection kind of a mindset? They're protecting themselves because if I don't recognize it, I don't have to do anything about it. I don't have to feel that, And so I was just curious about how you would do that, how you would talk to people like that and have them participate in a dialogue that they're really afraid to have.
Well, I wonder, could we ask Harold to answer that one?
Good afternoon. I think that we all decide what we bring to the table. We all have to decide that. I see as the responsibility of the responsible parties, the convener, the one responsible for that dialogue. I believe that that person is responsible for creating the right environments in which people will then choose. And that environment is one that's replete with safety. And then people will have to bring what they choose to bring into that environment. And my suspicion is that the more they participate and the more they realize the safety in the environment, the more it becomes humanized and the more they may choose to share of themselves in those environments. But we can't force it on anybody. I think we need to understand our responsibility to create that environment, and our responsibility to model the right things in that environment, and then others will decide to what degree they feel safe and can trust, and then choose to share of themselves.
Harold. Annette, you have one quick comment, and then we're going to move into the next phase of our session together.
Sure. So, it strikes me, and I'm really appreciative of everything that I'm hearing. It strikes me that we can't help organizations approach the is it loving unless and until we can practice and cultivate self-compassion and group compassion. And there was a part of me that I was hearing like the dialectic river of progress and then the river of decline, and relating that back to what we were doing with the 5 second, with the riddle, and wondering how many of us were in a sense of insecurity and self-criticism, and instead of trying to continue to solve the riddle, we spent the time on stopping ourselves from being self-critical or feeling insecure. And I just thought that was an interesting place to start.
Yeah, I think you're onto the way we are dramatic. I call that the dramatic bias. We did like the drama of all the world's a stage, and we've been wounded and hurt along the way, and we have these dramatic instances in our life that really just crowd our consciousness and play a role, right? But did you notice the assumption that you made, Annette? You said you can't do that at the organizational level unless here. I'm not sure. I think it's kind of both. I think, yes, you gotta kind of work with your own dramatic bias and all those hurts. But there's something about when I walk into I had the privilege of being in a room with 250 people in Virginia. And they were doing dialogue, and I came out, I wasn't even really engaged in the dialogue, but I came out of that room a better person. Something, they did something to me with just when I walked into the room. So I think there is, there's something there between the collective and the individual as well. It's what I would add to the question you're raising.
So we need to bring this to a close. I hate to, Tom, because I think people still have questions, and it's been so wonderful. But we will, let me just say that we are not going to have an interview during December, but we are in January. And I'm going to ask Linda if she'll talk about the speaker that we're going to have in January, the 15th, I believe.
Yeah, January 15th, same time, depending on where you're living, of course. I'm really excited to be able to introduce to us in January David Moody, who was the head of the Oak Grove School for a decade. And this was around the time when Krishnamurti and David Bohm were having amazing dialogues together, really exploring consciousness in a very minute, particular way. They actually, Bohm and Krishnamurti spent almost 2 decades in dialogue together in Ojai and in England. David Moody has written a book. It's called An Uncommon Collaboration between David Bohm and Krishnamurti. He's also just come out, and that one was written in 2017. He's just come out with another one, Krishnamurti in America, a new perspective on the man and his message. I have not read that one. I have read this one, which is very, very rich. And he also just presented at the Pari Center in a series on David Bohm this summer. And I listened to it, and I found him to be quite interesting as a speaker and very knowledgeable about what transpired between Krishnamurti and Bohm. So I think we'll learn some really precious pieces. So we will welcome you to that one in January. So this is a time now for reflections. And Tom, you actually offered a great reflection question, which was, I think, what was of most value, right?
Yeah, what was most helpful to you today?
Yeah. So we'll just take popcorn style, and Nancy, if you can help me because I can't see everybody. So just raise your hand if you'd like to make a comment on what was most helpful in the session today.
Linda, if you click on gallery view, it should say view at the top right, and go gallery view, you'll be able to see everyone.
Well, I have two screens, so I can only see one screen at a time on my.
We'll give people a minute to think about what they want to say or comment. That would be helpful.
You can also use the participants and just raise your hand that way.
Can I make a comment just to kick us off while
Sure.
you're working it out? To say, Tom, very much enjoy the session with you this evening, listening. In the background, I always had a slight worry because of your Carmelite years that you might be more solo. So if that was really your wife that we met, then I'm delighted to see her. It looked a fine character. So for me, that was very enriching to see, just start to see your wife and a sense of your family. What I liked was, although the format was question answer, you were quite carefully turning it around so that people noticed they were really inquiring rather than asking, that they could often do a fair amount of answering their own question. And it's a good skill to not have to assert your own view, but help other people to bring theirs out more clearly. So I enjoyed that. I quite like your attention on goodness and loving. I think they are seldom used in this area. So I think it's quite I would enjoy a deeper inquiry about what you mean by loving. And the gentleman who asked about working in prisons, often you're faced by a lot of damaged people, a lot to manage. I think you have to love yourself and care for yourself as well as love others. There's a kind of relationship between all of those. So my curiosity is then to understand a bit more about your varied life and how dialogue played out in different parts of it, in law and in the church and in prisons and in other organizations. So thank you for the evening. I enjoyed it.
Lloyd, did you have a reflection?
Yes, I just wanted to thank you for sharing this time with us, Tom. And I love the images and the form of the river of dialogue. And I know I'm going to be looking at the news and questioning now, is that the 5-cent answer? Is that the 10-cent answer? So thank you so much for that, Tom.
And if you'll just wave your hand, and then I'll try to catch it.
Lorenzo, would you like to offer? You're on mute. There you go.
Just one statement. Humor is transcendence. Thank you.
Nice.
I agree. I like that one too. That was important. We're just looking for other hands.
Teddy. Teddy, you're on mute.
Really appreciated the distinction of a river of progress versus the river of decline, and what I got to witness from our small group and with that. So thank you.
Thank you, Teddy. Other reflections? Jane.
Yeah, picking up on that, I find that I was rather more interested in the river of decline, which I was thinking, Tom, I'd like to hear more about that. So maybe another occasion. Like Lloyd, I know in our conversations previously, you have such a kind of great way of talking and drawing pictures as you talk. And I think that's a really, that's a real skill, kind of draws people in through the pictures and the storytelling. And then my third thing is, we talk about, about loving and is it loving and how to bring loving into an organization. I actually found you bringing your wife, who I've heard of many times but never met, but also your brother being here, and the woman whose child was in the background as well, that the sense of this being a family occasion, to me brought a sense of loving community into the session. And I've been thinking a lot recently how what we do and how we are together and individually is as important as what we say. So for me, that was a really strong message and strong takeaway from this session. So thank you. Nice to spend the evening with you and your family. Or the evening for me. I appreciate it's your morning.
Thanks.
And let me call on Julia.
Yeah, for me, it's really just like I learn by example, and the way you sit there and weave us in and tell stories and react to whatever people are asking and saying is super loving. So I'm just, yeah, awesome, inspired. Thanks a lot. Lots of love.
Modeling what you preach. Lovely. Any other reflections?
Harold.
Oh, Harold, please.
Yeah, Tom, again, I am also struck by your introduction of the concept of love into the conversation. I think it's a very powerful one, and it allows us to engage in some introspection as we participate in a dialogue. And it also allows us, I believe, to take the dialogue a lot deeper as well.
Absolutely.
And Eugene?
Hello, Tom. It's good having gone through MI with you and understanding the way that I look at things, because I've shared with you about my understanding of service before, and seeing how you had the conversation and in direct relationship to the conversation about dialogue when questions were asked. It wasn't so much that you, like the earlier respondent said, you're not imposing your answer to the question, but allowing the conversation, the dialogue to take place by allowing the other person to give the reflection on what they think it is. So it removes the opportunity, or rather the need for you to impose where you think you need them to go to, and allowing the conversation to take place in a lot more creative and constructive manner, because a lot of what we're asking is already answered within us. We just have to take the time to reflect on exactly what it is we're trying to say. And I think that's one of the more key factors to what you're talking about with the love that needs to be within there, because love requires respect, it requires service, it requires us making other people build themselves up opposed to us building them up. Because at the end of the day, they'll appreciate a lot more of where their efforts brought them opposed to where we took them. So I want to appreciate you for that and thank you. And I would very much like to find some more of your writing, if anything, that you've done on this. I want to read some more about that.
Thanks, Eugene. Thank you.
We have another 4 or 5 minutes if anyone else would like to say something. Mary-Eve?
I just want to make a comment about the staying capacity when, for instance, a CEO or a person you work with say, now we have to jump into action. You stay with what you feel is the move. And what I noticed is there are many ways of having a staying power. One is by a hard will, and that is creating friction. But the way you explain it, your staying power is very calm. And I think that I am not against anything, but I'm staying right there because I feel it's, and I like you exemplify the staying power that I find very touching and very powerful in a soft way. That's one of the things I draw from this presentation. Thank you very much.
Winding down, I'm looking for oh, Paula.
I'm sitting here and I'm reflecting on the word love, and I'm thinking that it's a very radical question to ask, actually. And I'm just wondering about that. I'm wondering about the possibility of asking it, and I'm wondering about the possibility of translating it, because there are places where it simply couldn't be asked, And that's why it's so radical to me.
Thank you, Paul.
Diane, did you raise your hand? I can't tell if you did or not. Maybe not.
No,
Oh,
I didn't raise
Linda.
my hand. I didn't raise my hand, but I will comment and just say that when we talk about love, so many people have different definitions for what love is. And I think that maybe that causes the challenge of mentioning it or bringing it up in a room, because you're not sure what the next person may perceive as love. And then you've got to deal with those differences and try to figure out how to get from point A to point B. But I enjoyed the session, and I thought it was very practical, as I wrote in the chat, and relative for what we're trying to do. And so I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. Linda, I saw you had your hand up. Linda Grove.
And let's let Linda be the last one, and then we'll then you please just leave as you will. Linda?
Yeah, I just appreciated all the analogies. It helps me remember things much better. And in particular, the fact that you really need to till the soil before any evidence-based practices are going to take hold. You know, really need to start at the basics. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
All right. Well, we want to thank all of you for making this such a rich session. We all contributed, and thank you for showing up. We look forward to seeing you in January. And if you want to just turn off your speakers and just say goodbye, whatever you want to do, clap, we're open for that. But we'll end our session now.
Bye. Linda.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone in America.
Awesome. Good to see everyone.
Bye.
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 Bye. Fantastic.
Yes, indeed.
Awesome.
It's lovely to hear all the sound, isn't it?
Thank you, everybody. Have a good time.
Okay. Have a good evening, wherever you are.
So much.
Slow left.